The man you're looking at is named Imre. He lives with cerebral palsy and, miraculously, alongside his grandparents, he survived a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. Despite the tremendous challenges they faced, his grandparents would eventually adopt him and move to California, where they would become his permanent caretakers. But horribly, decades later, this family would fall victim to an incredibly rare and horrible event that, to this day, has never been solved. I'll tell you everything, but, as usual, let's get into the backstories first. On Halloween night in 1977, 33-year-old Imre Robitsek sat inside his studio home in Los Angeles waiting for trick-or-treaters. It was just after 7:30 p.m. when the doorbell started ringing. As mentioned before, Imre lived with cerebral palsy, so he used a wheelchair and had limited mobility, but he was well known in the neighborhood and the kids couldn't wait to see him. On this night, he was alone. His 69-year-old grandfather, Zoltan Robitsek, who shared the home with him and served as his primary caregiver, was out of the house. Things went pretty routine, but at one point, the doorbell rang and Imre rolled up to the front door with a bowl of candy in hand, expecting to see a group of costumed children. But instead of kids looking for sweets, this time when Imre opened the door, it was an absolute nightmare. A man wearing a full-body skeleton costume stood there, and he wasn't asking for candy, but he was holding a club. And without warning, this man forced his way inside and slammed the door shut behind him. The man began striking Imre with the club repeatedly. Imre, who was alone and obviously unable to defend himself due to his disability, was overpowered almost immediately. The intruder then began questioning him, demanding to know when Zoltan would be home. Imre tried to respond, but he wasn't able to give a clear answer, and that only made things worse. The man knocked him from his wheelchair, tied him, and then waited in the house for Zoltan to return. And when Zoltan eventually came home later that night, the masked intruder ambushed him too. He launched an absolutely awful attack, beating Zoltan repeatedly with the same club while Imre laid there unable to intervene. And the struggle moved from the entryway to the bedroom, where the intruder ultimately overpowered the older man as well. And after this, he also tied Zoltan up and continued striking long after the fight was over. This horribly didn't stop until Zoltan lost consciousness. And after this, the man ransacked the home. He stole jewelry, $1,000 in cash, and Zoltan's van, which was a white 1971 Dodge outfitted with accessibility features so Imre could use it. The van was noticeably dirty and rusted and bore a California commercial license plate with the number 400-23L. To this day, this van has never been located. Still bound and left alone in the aftermath, poor Imre stayed on the floor for 2 hours before he was able to break free. And he managed to make it to a neighbor's house for help, but by the time paramedics and police arrived, it was too late. Zoltan was pronounced deceased at the scene. Imre's account gave police only a limited description. He said the attacker was between 5'10" and 6 feet tall with a slender build, but again he was completely covered in a skeleton costume and mask. The disguise left no identifying features visible, and there were no witnesses to the getaway. The van was gone and the trail went cold almost immediately. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, what made the attack even more devastating was the family's history. Imre had already lost both of his parents, and he was born in Hungary in 1944 during the Second World War. And as the bones of Autumn discovered and mentioned on a Reddit post, Imre, Zoltan, and Zoltan's wife Maria were all survivors of Dachau, one of the more well-known Nazi concentration camps. Their names appear in an archive that tracks victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. And after the war, Zoltan and Maria legally adopted Imre in 1950 because his parents were also no longer around and he really needed extra support with his disability. So the three moved to the US and settled in California, hoping for a better life. Maria passed away in 1975, just 2 years before the incident, leaving Zoltan as Imre's last living relative. The two were incredibly close, and Zoltan wasn't just Imre's grandfather, he was his full-time caretaker, his guardian, and his link to the outside world. And with Maria and Zoltan now gone, poor Imre had nowhere to go. Authorities determined he couldn't live alone, and he was sent to a care facility called the Spastic Children's Foundation. And 2 weeks after the homicide, Imre told a reporter that he wanted to return home, not just for familiarity, but to be reunited with Zoltan's Great Danes, who had been sent to the pound after the killing. Staff at the facility described Imre as stoic. He didn't talk much about what happened. Instead, he painted and wrote poetry to express himself. And Imre sadly passed away in the winter of 1989, over a decade later. He never got justice for what happened that night, the van was never found, and no arrests were ever made. The horrible human being in the skeleton costume vanished without a trace, and this case, like so many others, faded from public view. But behind it was a survivor, a man who had already lived through the unthinkable and still found the strength to rebuild his life, only to have the person who was closest to him taken away in one horrific night. Zoltan Robitsek's murder remains unsolved, and this is probably the most horrifying thing I've covered in this series so far. It really got to me, and it just goes to show how absolutely unfair life can be. This incredible family survived everything there is to survive. They did all the right things for themselves, and still, this is how life repays them. And this was the late 70s in California. It's not like this was that long ago. I will say, Emery strikes me as someone who didn't want pity, despite how people may want to portray the situation and consider his disability and all that. Rest in peace to all the members of this brilliant family who just could not catch a break. Cédrika Provencher was the kind of kid who stood out. She was confident, bright, energetic, and she lived in a neighborhood that she knew like the back of her hand. She was 9 years old in the summer of 2007, living in a city in Quebec, Canada. A quiet one halfway between Montreal and Quebec City that, out of respect for my French viewers, I won't even attempt to pronounce. Cédrika was the kind of girl who said hello to neighbors, played outside until the streetlights came on, and treated her red bicycle like it was a car of her own. But she was also careful. She was a smart girl and she knew to be home on time. During this specific summer, she had just finished 3rd grade and, like any kid, she was enjoying the freedom of being out of school. And on the evening of July 31st, 2007, it was warm and she was out playing near her home. But this is around the time where things started to get a little strange. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Cédrika knocking on doors, asking about a lost black and white dog. But she didn't have a black and white dog, meaning this had to be somebody else's. Neighbors say she told them she was helping someone find it, and several people pointed her in different directions, thinking they were just helping a little girl with a good heart. And then, just like that, this poor 9-year-old girl was never seen again. Cédrika's red bike was found, and it was upright, abandoned beside a hydro tower. It was like she just stepped off it for a second and never returned. And of course, when the poor girl didn't come home and the bike was found, her family called the police. Thankfully, authorities did not hesitate with this. A massive search was launched almost immediately, and over 200 officers from the provincial police, helicopters, canine units, divers, and volunteers from the community were mobilized. The search extended into woods, rivers, abandoned structures, anywhere a child could wander or have been taken. Posters of Cédrika's face went up in storefronts across the province, and her disappearance dominated news cycles in Quebec for weeks. One of the first main leads here was a reported sighting of a red Acura TSX in the area around the time of her disappearance. Police issued a public bulletin about the car, hoping someone had seen it or had a license plate, but sadly, there were no major breaks in the case, and Cédrika's name remained in the public eye, her case often being mentioned alongside other unsolved abductions. Her family never gave up though, and neither did law enforcement. Then horribly, in December 2015, so more than 8 years after she vanished, hunters walking in a wooded area near St. Maurice, roughly 15 kilometers from where Cédrika was last seen, stumbled upon human remains. The area was very remote and forensic testing confirmed what many had feared. The remains belonged to Cédrika. There was no clear cause of death released to the public, and there were no new suspects named at the time, but investigators were already far down a different path, one that they had kept close to the chest for years. In 2016, police began to focus heavily on a man named Jonathan Betez, a man from the same area who owned a red 2004 Acura TSX, matching the vehicle seen near Cédrika's last known location. And for the police, this wasn't just a hunch. Over the course of a year, investigators launched one of the most exhaustive surveillance operations in the province's recent memory. Betez was watched, wiretapped, and trailed by police. His calls were recorded, his texts were reviewed, and covert audio and visual surveillance captured hours of his daily movements. I've seen that officers even placed hidden GPS trackers on his vehicle to map his exact route and monitor whether he returned to any potentially incriminating locations. This guy was followed to work, to restaurants, and to his home, and the entire time, investigators were hoping he'd slip. Maybe he'd say something revealing, visit the wrong place, or show a reaction if confronted with the news about Cédrika, but he never did. Then, police executed a search warrant for Betez's digital devices, and what they found was disturbing. He was in possession of dozens of CP files, and he was arrested and formally charged with multiple counts of possessing and accessing CP. But this is where things get incredibly aggravating, especially if you're familiar with how poorly this sort of stuff is handled here in Canada. In court, the evidence that they found fell apart. A judge ruled that the warrant used to access Betez's cloud storage violated his charter rights, claiming it was overly broad and improperly obtained. As a result, the most damning evidence was thrown out, and he was acquitted in 2018. Now, I couldn't get details on exactly what they found or if it was related to Cédrika, but either way, what the hell, man, this guy was acquitted. And no matter how you cut it, we already know 100% that he had that stuff. But he was acquitted on all 10 charges because the judge deemed it a fishing expedition by the police. And from a pure legal standpoint, there's nothing I can say obviously, but like, come on, man. And he was actually already rumored to be related to this somehow as early as 2011 when certain journalists tried questioning him. So although I'm a province over from Quebec, maybe some of my French Canadian viewers can elaborate on this, like maybe that name was going around long before it was actually in the news. Despite the scale of the surveillance operation and his status as a prime suspect, Betez has never been charged in connection with Cédrika's abduction or homicide, and police have not identified anyone else. Even after all this time, Cédrika's case remains unsolved. Her disappearance and murder shook the province and spurred changes to how missing children cases are handled in Quebec. Her family, particularly her father, Martin Provencher, continues to advocate for justice, and her story continues to haunt the public, but it hasn't really become a popular story outside of the province that it happened in. In fact, I can't really find anyone covering it in English on YouTube, so thank you to this commenter who recommended this to me after seeing the Valerie LeBlanc case the other day. It's nice to be able to help get eyes on these lesser known cases, even if it's just a little bit, because the more these names are said and kept alive, the more likely we are to one day get an answer, and I would just really love to one day see some of the cases I discuss get solved. A lot of these really stay in my head after covering them, and as I get more and more viewers, I'll probably circle back on a few of them. I believe that somebody knows what happened that day, and someone knows who lured her with a fake story about a dog. And terribly, somebody is still walking free. 18 years later, Cédrika's red bike is long gone, but her name and what happened to her still hangs over Quebec like a shadow that won't lift. "17-year-old Lydia Fowler had just started building a life she could be proud of. She had a job she loved, a tight-knit family to support her, and a routine that made her feel secure. Her days were structured, her responsibilities were clear, and her social circle was small but meaningful. She had recently moved in with her older sister and brother-in-law in New Whiteland, Indiana, after graduating high school just 5 months earlier. The plan was simple: she'd work hard, stay close to family, and maybe figure out her future along the way. Lydia worked as a typist at the Indiana National Bank, and by all accounts, she took the job seriously. But she wasn't just all work, she enjoyed herself too. Thursday nights were for bowling. She was part of the bank women's bowling league and bowled pretty often at the B&Y Lanes in Indianapolis, and that's exactly where she was on the evening of October 9th, 1959. At around 5 p.m., Lydia ate dinner at the Washington Hotel before heading to the bowling alley. She played her games, chatted with teammates, and wrapped up the night just after 9 p.m. According to her coworker and teammate, Eunice Bray, Lydia left the bowling place alone. She walked away from the alley and headed towards the nearby Circle Theater where there was a payphone booth and a meeting spot to get picked up when her brother-in-law was off work at 11:30 p.m. This was her usual Thursday night routine. She'd go bowling, call her ex-boyfriend Jesse from a payphone, presumably to burn some time, and then get a ride home from her brother-in-law Carlos, who worked late shifts. And at first, that night was no different. But Carlos arrived at the theater, so at their meeting spot, at 11:30 p.m. as planned, and Lydia wasn't there. He circled the area for nearly half of an hour before being pulled over by a police officer. When he explained what he was doing, the officer helped him search the theater, but they found nothing. Lydia had vanished, and so, just after midnight, she was officially reported missing. The immediate search began with the people closest to her. Carlos confirmed that Lydia had prearranged for him to pick her up that night, and her ex-boyfriend Jesse, just 16 at the time, confirmed that he had indeed spoken to Lydia on the phone around 10:30 p.m. from outside the Circle Theater. During that call, Lydia reportedly mentioned that there was a strange man nearby, someone with a mustache and a darker complexion. She said that this man had been following her, but according to Jesse, she didn't even sound afraid, she just mentioned it in passing. Still, that little detail stuck. Police began interviewing Lydia's coworkers at the bank. Some described her as intelligent but shy, and a few recalled that she had been trying to avoid calls from a man who she'd previously dated. The calls had supposedly stopped weeks earlier, but it still raised questions. Who else had she been involved with recently? Was someone who wasn't Jesse still trying to reach her, or were these comments about him? There were whispers of an older man named Alan who had once walked Lydia to her sister's home and spent time chatting with her on the front porch. This man came to mind because another sibling of Lydia's, Mildred, saw the man and immediately felt that something was off. She called her inside and sent her husband Glenn to ask the man to leave, and Glenn offered him a ride, but the man declined, claiming he lived nearby. And after that suggestion came a witness sighting, an usher at the Circle Theater named Richard Harris, who recalled seeing Lydia in the lobby that night. At first, she was alone, but then later on she was in the upstairs area, sipping a soft drink with an older man. He described the man as being in his 30s, wearing tan clothes, and sporting a bushy mustache. After that, both of them were gone. Weeks would pass, the trail would grow cold, and then everything changed. On November 10th, nearly a month after Lydia went missing, 2 young men were rabbit hunting near a bridge in the 4800 block of Man Road, about 10 miles from downtown Indianapolis. While fighting their way through overgrowth under the bridge, they stumbled onto something that made their blood run cold. It was a deceased individual in later stage decomposition, lying face up in a ravine beneath the bridge. Police were called immediately, and the body was quickly identified as Lydia Fowler. Her death was not peaceful. She had suffered a 6-inch skull fracture, broken ribs, a fractured hip, and deep road rash. She was partially clothed, but a ton of her stuff was missing. This includes her pink jacket, black high-heeled shoes, purse, jewelry, and other personal effects. The condition of the scene was disturbing but not conclusive. Due to decomposition, it couldn't be determined whether Lydia had for sure been a victim of prior assault. Still, investigators found signs of it. Her bra was torn and her sweater was pulled over her head. Some injuries were consistent with being struck by a blunt object, and a stain found on a nearby piece of concrete was tested but came back inconclusive. An early theory emerged. Lydia may have tried to escape an unwanted advance, jumped from a moving vehicle to protect herself, and then was struck or killed that way. But that didn't explain the type of blunt force trauma to her skull, and another theory suggests that she was hit with something like a crowbar or wrench and then dumped off the bridge. The case quickly gained attention and tips flooded in. Some were credible and others bizarre. One woman claimed the killer was a man and a woman who looked like trees, whatever that means. Another caller reported a man living under a house only coming out at night. Despite the odd and likely trolling nature of these tips, every single one was followed up. But then there finally came a lead that was worth pursuing. On November 21st, an anonymous caller reported overhearing 2 men brag about being with Lydia the night she vanished. One even said she had jumped from their car. The men were identified as 19-year-old Jean Rich and 26-year-old Verdon Stewart. They were questioned immediately. Jean worked as a gravedigger and Verdon was a crane operator. Neither could account for their whereabouts the night Lydia disappeared, and during questioning, police discovered Jean's car had been impounded after being towed from a no parking zone just a week after Lydia vanished. He initially reported it stolen, but later admitted he had just forgotten where he parked it while he was drunk. Blood-like stains were found on the exterior, along with minor damage, but testing revealed it was just rust. Verdon's vehicle was also tracked down, abandoned at a junkyard in Kentucky, and police located it and found more stains inside of damage, but again, tests were inconclusive. Both men were arrested and charged with manslaughter, but they were released when the evidence didn't hold up. Back in Indianapolis, police were still searching for the older man seen with Lydia. And November 11th, just one day after she was found, that Alan Kent guy I mentioned voluntarily walked into the sheriff's office. He admitted to knowing Lydia, but he said they only met one night at a bus stop in downtown Indianapolis, and he claimed they'd gone on a few dates, but she stopped returning his calls. He denied ever seeing her again after that. He even submitted to a polygraph test and passed. His car showed no signs of damage, and he told detectives he hadn't come forward sooner because he didn't know she was missing. That was until he saw the newspaper. But Richard Harris, the theater usher, was asked if Alan was the man he saw with Lydia that night, and he said no. So yeah, it seems this Alan guy really actually didn't have anything to do with it. The case began to stall and other people of interest came and went. Known murderers and even serial offenders in the region were questioned, but no charges ever stuck. The last real mention of Lydia's case came in 1970, and since then it's remained unsolved for more than 6 decades. Lydia Fowler was laid to rest in Morgantown, Indiana, and more than 200 people attended her funeral. Her parents, Zita and Lester, were there, along with her siblings and co-workers. Her ex-boyfriend, Jesse Newkirk, who had been one of the first people to sound the alarm, passed away in 2012. So did Jean Rich and Verdon Stewart, and many of Lydia's immediate family have also since passed. Many hope that someone out there still knows the truth, though it's sadly unlikely that this bizarre case will ever be solved simply due to the time. Rest in peace to this poor girl. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. If you like these types of videos, I upload 2 or 3 every week, so please consider subscribing, but if not, it's okay.